Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Sunday, May 17th, 2020, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. I'm Patrick Hoffman, a product manager at Google and a mentor lead in a Product Mentor program. The Product Mentor program is a global initiative in over 20 countries around the world where mentors and mentees get paired up in the field of product management to help make better product decisions, better products, and better product people. Learn more at theproductmentor.com. Today, I'll be leading a conversation on how to become a better product manager by mentoring other product managers. Please post your questions to the YouTube channel, chat, and I'll do my best to answer them in real time. So today I'm going to be talking about product management mentorship and the role it can play in leveling yourself up as a product manager, how it makes you better, while also giving back to the product community. So who I am. I'm currently a product manager over at Google, like I said, but in the past, right, I've worked at a lot of different places in the last 10 plus years. And I've also mentored a lot of PMs in many different places as well. So some of the few things I've done, right, I've worked in micromobility, ride sharing, education tech, e-commerce, and I've worked in companies from 4 people, where I'm one of the first 4 people building it, all the way up to 100,000, right? I'm at Google, it's quite a large company. And so mentorship actually has helped me level up my career all the way to where I am. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later as far as what leveling looks like and how mentorship plays into that. I've done everything from being a senior individual contributor to being a director of product and design groups, and now back to being a senior IC and just really enjoying that, right? I've worked across different markets, B2B to C, so how do I sell to businesses and then the consumers, B2B dynamics, direct to consumer as well. I've been lucky to mentor a number of mentees across other areas that I've never actually worked in, right? So I've mentored product managers that work in the furniture space, where they end up actually reporting into chief marketing officers. I've mentored product managers and directors of product managers in other industries such as oil and gas, marketing technology, companies, PMs that are working at companies dealing with far different problems than I was at that time in my career dealing with. And so one of the really cool things about this and why mentorship is so cool, I'm going to touch on that later, is that you end up building up a library of patterns, right? You end up learning about what works and what doesn't work in different companies with different product managers, different markets, different customers, different contexts. And every new story you build up, right? Every new case you work through with your mentees adds to your ability to bring those talents to bear when you're actually at work, right? Whether you're mentoring other product managers at your own company, working together as a team to become better, or bringing those talents and those skills to how you work with your engineering managers and your engineering teams, your design teams, right? The skills that you develop by being a product mentor actually come to bear very much in your day-to-day job as a PM and can help you level yourself up as you go along, whether that, and we'll touch on that later, but whether you want to work at a larger company or whether you want to just get into a deeper and deeper role or more senior role. So today we're going to be covering a few different topics, but really focused around this topic of PMs mentoring other PMs, right? I'm going to touch on how it's going to make you a more effective product manager, why you would want to even do it, whether it's the right fit for you at the time that you're doing it, and how ultimately it helps build you up to be a better product leader, right? So to get started, let's really address this question of leveling, right? And so as I'm going to touch on, there's basically 3 key levers in this. There's your company size. There's the scale of the projects or products that you're working on, right? So whether it's an individual product or a very large multifaceted product, as well as then your role, right? So are you a senior, are you an individual contributor as a PM? Are you a director of PM? Are you a VP of PM? Or even later in your career to become a chief product officer or maybe even a CEO? So as I'm kind of mapping out here, right, there's basically these 3 axes. At any given time, you as this dot, you can be at any given point in this, right? And so that's a really interesting dynamic for product managers because you have a lot of control in your career. You can choose potentially that you could take a lateral move, over to a different company, maybe even move down by some measures, right? If you happen to be a director of product at a company of 2,000 people, but you really want to go after a larger problem that company isn't quite able to address. Maybe you'll transition into a larger company, a 16,000 person company, 18,000 person company, one of those Fortune 500 type places. And when you do that, right, you're not going to be transitioning in as a director or as a VP necessarily, right? Though that does happen. And so you may want to, at that time, choose to come down a little bit as far as like the PM ladder, right? And instead become an individual contributor, working with a team of engineers, again, really getting down in the weeds on technical issues, customer problems, discovery, design, et cetera. And that's a choice, right? So in many ways, your product career is a roller coaster of your own design. And so, that's something that I've been experiencing. It's something that many of the mentees that I've worked with have experienced, many of my peers at other companies and in my own company have experienced, right, and discussed. And people also move in and out of product management. They move into operations, they may move into strategy, sales, and back into product, right? So really it's about how do you over time build out that path for yourself. And I'm going to be talking about how mentoring other PMs actually can help you make those decisions, help you decide where you're going to be going, but also gives you that confidence that when you are in the workplace, you're able to work with other product managers and help guide them and coach them and not necessarily direct them. I'm going to be touching a bit later on about the difference between mentorship, coaching, how it's different in that you're not really getting into the management, right? The authority side is very different. As I've been saying, right, like it's about leveling yourself up, right? And so you get these different contexts, you learn to guide other product managers, right? Product management is a very difficult job, requires a very broad skill set, and also a very deep, set of skills in certain areas. And your ability as a product manager to work through problems with other PMs, but not tell them the solutions is incredibly important. It ultimately makes you more effective as a product manager. And when you're mentoring other people, right, you're bringing your back experience to bear and helping them figure these things out as well. And so the goal there, right, and the goal why we even do this whole program is to help make other product managers more effective. Because more effective product managers create better products, and ultimately better products should hopefully help make the world a better place, or at least help us adjust to different things. So, as I mentioned, right, there's also this question of context. In addition to the layer of context, there's also the different PM challenges that you end up dealing with, right? And so the amazing thing about when you mentor is that unlike when you're on the job and every decision is just super critical, right? It's a little bit like practice, right? So when you're having a working session with your mentee, your focus is on the mentee. Your focus isn't on you. Your focus is on the issue that they have or helping them discover what issue there is to work through. And for PMs, right, there's a lot of just common problems and cases that we work through, whether it's product strategy, career development, operations, and impact reporting. Like, how do you as a PM, report impact and show impact, right? That is one that has, really, I don't want to say plagued necessarily, but it's definitely challenged many PMs throughout their careers. How do they effectively show the impact of what they're doing, right? It's not like they can simply say, hey, I've written X amount of lines of code, et cetera. They have to really get into the revenue, get into the customers, get into how to position their company to actually be successful, by respecting the opportunity they have in the market, by respecting their users and really doing the best for those users. And so the really cool thing about mentorship, right, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that you also get exposure to different products, different technologies, business models, et cetera, right? So like, would I ever have considered, being a product manager in oil and gas? To date, no, not really. But I had the opportunity to actually mentor a product manager that was working in a technology group within oil and gas, building software to help oil and gas companies kind of better distribute their oil and gas, decide what to turn on when, what bidding, et cetera, right? Really interesting, like meaty stuff. And by going through the cases of how do you set product vision in that context, how do you work with your stakeholders, how do you work with engineers there, I was able to pull lessons from that even back into my own job as a product manager, right? I was able to build up a pattern library. And so there's going to be a point throughout this talk, right, is that one of the biggest reasons to go out there and to mentor other people, right, beyond sharing your experience and giving back, is to continue to be building up your product library, right? So like, what have you seen? What patterns do you see? Because every pattern you've seen, provided you can check that bias at times, helps you deal with any new situation, right? Like today, we're in a crazy new world in many ways, with everything going on with COVID, many businesses shutting down, et cetera. And it's not a thing that we could have predicted. But there are patterns and methods that we can apply to this new space as product managers to help our companies, to help our customers navigate through it and come out of it better on the other side, hopefully. So we're going to go into a lot of detail about what it takes to mentor, right? And the simple thing is that upfront, it takes a commitment and a lot of time from yourself and also from the mentee, right? So accountability is going to come into play, scheduling is going to come into play, and more. So before I get to that, though, like, it's really key to also hook in on the fact that mentoring isn't coaching, right? So I don't know how many of you have perhaps played Pee Wee soccer or college athletics, or even watched athletic matches, whether it's cricket, baseball, soccer, etc., right? But in a lot of those cases, you might see a coach like the guy on the left who's yelling at his players and trying to micromanage them and tell them every single thing to do, right? Well, mentorship isn't that. You're not going to be there with your mentee in the room when they're presenting to their CEO, or when they're making the case to their stakeholders, or when they're working with a customer to understand their problems, right? You can't be micromanaging. So as a mentee, as a mentor, your focus is really on helping build up those patterns. And in many ways, you might end up being a little bit more like the coach on the right. That person is sitting there, they've focused on getting the team and the individuals to go through the motions, to build up the patterns, to get that practice in play prior to the match. And at that point in time, right, they sit back, they're quiet, and maybe during an intermission, they'll connect with the team, they'll discuss a few key strategies, a few key things of what's going on, but ultimately they're trusting that they've built up that individual and built up the teams they work with to be most effective given any context that you go into, right? Whether it's a different team, a different match, different weather, they can't tell those people what to do. They're going to sit back and trust that they've done the hard work up front to make them most effective in the context where they are. And so that's something that really actually does come more into mentoring, right? So you're not in a position of authority as a mentor, right? Yes, you may be more experienced, you may be more senior, they may be coming to you definitely with trust, like that's critical. And they may be looking up to you given your years of experience, because typically you'll have more years of experience than them. But again, I've also mentored PMs with equal amount of years. And it's really about your time, right? So like your expertise and your time. So I've mentored PMs that are in B2B spaces and they've never dealt with direct to consumer. But even though we're at similar levels, they really want to understand direct to consumer, to understand if it's the right path, right market space for them to go into with their career, but also whether there's room with their existing company to carve out a space for direct to consumer products, for direct to consumer go to market promotion. And so that point is really key, right? Like, this is about your expertise, about the context, about the patterns that you're building up. And it's about really going through the motions, right? So the same thing as in, let's say it's soccer and you have corner kicks, and you're going to just practice and practice and practice the motion of, doing a corner kick successfully, or taking a penalty kick successfully, or doing a starter match successfully. The same things apply to the product management side. And so with your mentees, right, the goal is to set objectives and then work through those. And typically those objectives, like I mentioned earlier, map to common product challenges. And these challenges typically involve things like setting roadmaps, doing storytelling, doing stakeholder management. Communication actually is one of the key things that I've seen across all the mentees I've worked with. But also, where are you in your career? How do you understand whether it's time to make a change? How do you even, if you want to stay at the current company and level up, how do you have that conversation with your manager to help them understand that you are ready for that next challenge, that you're both keen to it, but also have the skills to do it, right? It's a really tricky, tough thing as product managers. And so by being able to walk through, even, like doing a practice round with me as a mentor and the mentee treating me like I'm their manager and having that conversation, they're able to, test out, try different things, kind of play it out in a practice phase, and then go out, do it, and then ultimately loop back with you, right? It's a big feedback loop. It's very much like, product managers, we love agile, engineers are pretty big on agile too. It's that feedback loop. And so the big thing in mentorship and mentoring is that feedback loop. And the crux here, right, is about learning. So as I mentioned, context and practice, end of the day, it all comes down to learning, right? So the reason that a person would seek out a mentor is because they're looking to learn something new. They're looking to go deeper into some area or get exposure to something that they don't have exposure to on a regular day-to-day basis. And this is true whether it's in product management mentoring folks or the designers that I've mentored before as well. And so, this is something that as you level up in your career, as you get into more management positions, it's really key, because a lot of managers make the mistake of thinking that their job is to tell the team what to do. And the most effective managers actually focus more on the frameworks and on the objectives, while building up the creativity and the trust within the team that they can find a path to hit those objectives. And so as a mentor, how you should be judging yourself and how successful you are is the degree to which you're able to, transfer some of that knowledge that you've picked up over your years of practice and help your mentee build that up. Ideally, any mentee you work with, given enough time, they should also be going out and mentoring other PMs, and really working with other PMs to take the lessons they've learned from you and bring it to bear there as well, right? While layering on top their own unique individual lessons that they're getting, right? So I'm going to touch on this point again, right? And it's really key, right? So you may want to go and become a product mentor to build up those contexts, to build up that exposure to common PM challenges. But that's the kind of the same reason that your PM mentee is also coming into play, right? And so for things to be successful, really both of you need to want to have this type of relationship where you're able to share these different lessons, go after these common challenges. 1 second, we do have a question. Hannah would like to know if there are any qualifications that I think are important to have before becoming a mentor to other product managers. And I'm going to be touching this definitely a bunch later on, but a few key things come in, right? You actually need to have time available. And I know that sounds potentially silly as being a requirement or qualification, but time is one of the hardest things for product managers, particularly young product managers, to come by, right? The newer you are in your career, the more you have to commit time and spend time just to really get to build up expertise and to build up confidence in the work that you're doing, whether it's writing requirements, working with engineers, reviewing design docs and weighing in from the business and customer perspective, writing product requirements, going over design, et cetera, right? And so as a mentor, actually, it's a pretty huge time commitment to mentor somebody else, because you have to do preparation and work in advance. So that's one thing, like out of the gate. The other one is having knowledge that you think you can share, and ideally that others are coming to, right? So while I've only been formally mentoring product managers as a mentor lead in this program for the last 3 or so years, I did end up mentoring product managers and other people before that, right? So even in my very first company, Social Bicycles, I wound up mentoring some of the other people on our team. They weren't my reports, I wasn't managing them, but I recognized that there was areas where they maybe wanted to improve, and that there was knowledge I had that they wanted to learn from, right? And so through those cases, I was able to help them reach decisions as far as where they should go in their career, whether they should head into data science and the product management. And we ultimately built out a team of product managers there under my guidance. So basically, like, I think it's the expertise paired with the time commitment, and then the willingness to frankly go and learn what it takes to be a mentor. And so the other good thing is that, part of what I'm going to be touching on here is what it takes to be a mentor, what kind of frameworks go into play, and how you can leverage those to really be effective as a product mentor. So thank you, Hannah, for the question. And so ultimately, like this question of development, right? You're developing your mentee, and you're also developing yourself, as I mentioned here, talking with Hannah. So whether it's getting exposure to new company structures, new business models, new customer types, right? When you first start off in your career, maybe you're 2 years in or 3 years into one company. Maybe it's a really big company, right? Like it's an 18,000 person company. They have many different business groups, but you're in one tiny, relatively tiny one, right? Say a 1,000 person group with an 18,000 person company. And you may only be dealing with a market that's basically business to business. So you're selling to very large companies. And you may only be dealing with one, really focused product. Let's say it's marketing technology. And even within that, you may be doing one slice, one subset piece of that, right? Let's say that's building up, the next version of that product, right? So if you're in that depth, you have a lot of expertise that you've built up in SaaS, in enterprise product management, and working with enterprise context, potentially even having an air-gapped product. And so while on the surface, you may not be able, or you may not feel that you're confident enough and capable to go and mentor a direct-to-consumer market PM, the reality is you've built up a lot of lessons from that space that while they may not be immediately applicable to PMs that are operating in a direct consumer space, the challenge that you've dealt with, the methods you've found to work through is actually are applicable. And so those pieces make it so that like when you're one PM and you've focused and gone deep in an area for 3 years, you do have expertise to share, and you really should be willing to go out and mentor. And again, like your first time mentoring, just like your first time getting into product, it's going to be really scary. And you may think that you're way over your head, right? And so a key thing I would say is actually to also find or try and participate in programs like this where you're working with other product mentors and you can learn from them about what works, what doesn't, right? Best practices. It's key to product mentorship and mentorship in general. So as far as like what it takes to be a successful mentor, right? There's kind of, this is my checklist that I think through. And I'm gonna go deeper into this as we go forward, but believe it or not, your biases are really important to go after. And typically people think about biases as being about people, individuals, maybe companies. Sure, those are certain types of biases. There's other ones that come up into play for product managers, right? So like, how do you go out doing a PRD? What is the right way to run a Scrum team or an Agile team? What is the right way to structure requirements? How do you communicate with stakeholders, et cetera, right? And so while there may be things that have worked for you as a product manager in your career that have helped you level up, you need to be really aware that those may not work as well for others. And so again, like when you get into mentorship, it's about the mentee. So you need to check your back experience at the door. It's there to rely on, right? It's there to guide you, but your focus is on the mentee, their context, and helping them level up. And so really, like out of the gate, you want to be establishing those expectations. I'll touch on some of the details about that later. You want to definitely go through assessing needs. PMs, we're pretty good at that, right? We work with customers, we work with the market problem to figure out what is it that they actually need, not just what they're saying, but like going deeper, right? Getting into things like the infinite hows, asking those hard questions, right? And ultimately from that, then working back to clear goals. And so a lot of product managers earlier in their career aren't as familiar with OKRs. Luckily, it's becoming more of a common thing today. But the OKRs you set in the business setting are just as applicable as a framework to you as an individual, right? You can set an objective and you can work as a key result, right? So like 3 years ago, for me, an objective, was to level up my career, get a new title at a much larger company than I was, right? I was at like an 80-person company. I wanted to go work for a company that was at least 500 to 1,000 people. And I wanted to be at a company that had a path for me to get to a point of managing and directing other product managers, right? And so that was an objective. And then I worked that back to what are the key results, right? And I worked with a mentor to figure out like, how do I go about taking those steps? And then the schedule piece is really key, right? And I'll touch on that as well. But then as with most work with product managers, right, they listen, talk less, although I'm here talking a lot, but talk less, listen more. Ask probing questions, right? Ask questions that aren't a yes, no. Ask questions that, guide the mentee to talk more, to share more about how they're thinking about a problem, their background, any concerns they have, any questions they have about their confidence, right? And as you do unpack an issue and find a thing, don't tell. And I'm going to touch on that a lot later, right? But that's a really key thing, right? Don't tell your mentee, guide them. And be accountable, be accessible. And frankly, those ones go both ways, right? For both the mentee and the mentor. So that's another thing that it's required to be effective in this. So as far as the biases, right? Just first recognize that you have them. We all do, right? We build them up through the people we interact with, through the society that we operate in, through the companies we operate in. And frankly, the world changes fast. Like if you look back at the last 10 years, it's been a wild ride. And it's like that year on year on year, right? So it's important as a product manager to not go into a situation and assume that you know how it's going to play out, assume that you know everything, assume that you know best, right? So you want to understand the context and then learn about how what you do know can be applied to that context. And then you're going to test out whether it's working successfully or whether there's changes that you want to be going after and making, right? And it's really important to recognize like we're all unique. Right, so like each of my mentees, they've had a completely different experience getting into product, working in product, navigating their career path in product than what I've had, right? By many measures, I got into product development all the way back in college when I did a startup and when I ran a research lab with other people. But it wasn't officially, until 2012 that I was really into product management by what the industry said it was. And even then, right, there was so little information out there that I had to go and figure out what that was for myself. I didn't have people at my company that knew what it was, that were saying what it was, right? I certainly had engineers that had expectations about what product managers did, but those differed, right? My embedded software engineers thought it was one thing, my web engineers thought it was another, the engineers I worked with at partner companies thought it was a completely different thing, right? And so the learning part is there, and those experiences I built up are going to be different than what my mentees built up. And so I can share my experiences and hopefully help guide them, and similarly recognize that like what I've learned or how product has changed in the last 10 years. PMs coming in today are dealing with different challenges. In some ways, like they're really off to the races faster, right? Like Agile's out there, methodologies are out there, teams are more aware of the value of product, right? So a lot of the early challenges that folks like myself dealt with, they're not as prevalent. They're still there, depending on the size of the company and the space it's in and the background of the founders and their teams, but it's a little bit less so at times. And so like the whole biases, right, is just make sure you're aware of them. Make sure you go slow, right? This gets back to that point about listening deeply. So listen, think, and then actually talk and express and guide, right? Don't just say right what comes off the top of your head, or try not to, right? Like sometimes you can't avoid it, but just try not to. As far as establishing the expectations, right? As I mentioned, product mentoring or mentoring of any kind really takes a lot of time. And to do it right, you need to recognize either two things. One, what's the issue problem that you and the mentee are going to be tackling, and then set the time to fit that problem. Or two, if you have a fixed set of time, for instance, like we have here in the Product Mentor program where there's a set number of weeks over like 5 months that we get to work, then go after problems that fit that size of time, right? Like when you're talking an hour or more each week, week on week for months, you can really go after big, hairy problems, not just necessarily one problem, right? Although there may be one core objective that you're going after, but a number of different ones, right? And so I've worked with mentees going after objectives such as becoming better storytellers and able to land a vision, right? And they then break that down to landing the vision with their executive stakeholders, with their sales stakeholders, with their engineering stakeholders, with other product managers of their company, and frankly, with their customers ultimately. And so each of those alone, you can unpack, and that can be a 4-week problem to work through, right? It's not that a person can just learn it and then instantly do it, right? They have to try and they have to go through the work and the labor. And so the spacing is key as well, right? So actually having that break, whether it's 3 days or 7 days in between, is critical to giving the mentee time to develop, time to try things out, and then frankly come back and tell you what's working, what's not, so you can go in and unpack it and go deeper, right? In addition to the timing piece and establishing expectations there, right, you want to really go after what is it that they should expect from you and what is it they shouldn't expect from you, and vice versa, right? So as a mentee, right, the objectives, like we want them to really care about their career, care about the objectives they set and commit to those, right? And ideally pick ones and structure ones that can't be easily knocked aside, right? And so unfortunately, like sometimes you can't plan against that, right? Like things like COVID, there were plenty of mentees that their objectives got potentially skewed off. If their company was impacted, if their personal family was impacted, if their community was impacted, right? But there are goals that you can set that are not tied to specific projects and that are tied to you as a product manager and applicable to you as a product manager across different companies. Those are the kind of objectives that you, as far as an expectation, you want to be pushing them to set, right? And setting how you're going to help them work through it, saying what kinds of questions it's okay to ask, and maybe which one is not okay to ask, right? There may be certain things that are sensitive that you as a product manager just aren't yet able to share based on the company you're at, and things like that, right? But you also want to make it clear to them whether you're going to be willing to, open doors to other product managers, other executives, other companies, right? You really should, frankly, it's one part of the giving back. But if there's cases where you're not willing to make certain introductions, just state that up front, right? Be clear of what the expectations are and what they can expect from you as someone who's a bit more experienced and farther down the career. And so, let's say that you establish those expectations, you've had that whole initial conversation, right? The next really key thing is understand your mentee, understand what the issues are they're dealing with today, right, or as they see them, and be able to ask those questions, which I've mentioned and I'll touch on later, right? But asking them questions that don't end up in a yes, no, but end up in a how, right? So like, how are you dealing with this situation? How might you, right? And I'm going to touch on that piece later as well, right? But these are some of the questions here that you might actually use in this initial needs finding, right? And these are just 5, right? Frankly, there's like 50 that I've used and have like a go-to list. Some on paper, some mostly in my head, just of like what's worked, what hasn't. And the goal here is to understand the context, to build up that context of where's your mentee, where's their company. If they have a manager, most of people do, right? So where's their manager, what's their background? You'd be surprised how many product managers report to people who've never actually been product managers, right? They may have an MBA, they may have done operations, they may have done sales even, but sometimes they haven't actually done product management, and they got routed into that because the company felt it was the best thing for them to do. So the key thing here, right, is for you to just ask those questions and sit back and listen, right? Frankly, take notes. So if you're doing video calls, you can take notes. It's really nice and clean. If you're in person, you may want to ask you could choose to record, but you'll want to ask your mentee if it's okay for you to record, just so you can listen back to it later and make sure you pulled out all the key points. And after your first couple sessions, right, it's really good to summarize what you've heard and share that back with them and see if it's what they've also heard. Make sure that they're agreeing with where you're guiding, with where you're looking to go, right? And frankly, like, they're the ones that are leading. You're just helping kind of set the swim lane that maybe is the most productive to go after. The mentee ultimately owns what they're going to get out of the mentor-mentee relationship. And that kind of ties into that piece of the OKRs, right? As a mentor, you could come in and say, okay, like, based on what I heard, this is the objective, and these are the key results, and this is what I expect you to do. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. You really shouldn't. Unlike managers and companies who maybe sometimes, step into doing that, you're not in a position of authority here. And you really need to have the mentee be invested and bought into doing the work that it takes to hit that objective, right? And so let's say that there's an objective around understanding data and leveraging data to drive product decisions, right? Well, then you can start unpacking that, right? Because data looks very different in a direct-to-consumer company that maybe is, formed in the last 2 years, 3 years, when analytics is huge, versus a direct-to-consumer company that was built 10 years ago when pieces of analytics weren't as large, or in a direct-to-consumer company versus an air-gapped enterprise company, right? So those contexts there, like, that's key, and you want to really go through that, right? And you want to be able to break each of those things, each goal down, typical OKR style, right? So set the objective, what's the key result? So as I mentioned earlier, right, if it's the vision setting and communication, being able to tell that story to the executives. I mean, it's that same story, but perhaps with different language to your engineers. And then having methods in place that you know it, right? So whether it's the vision setting or if it's making data-driven decisions with product, it's then understanding, okay, what does data look like in my company? Do I have a system for even getting the data? Once I have that data, do I have a system for collating it and synthesizing it? And then once I do have that, do I have a method of applying it to the questions and the product decisions that we're looking at making? So we have one more question, and I'll touch in on. So Juan would like to know, how to make sure that, if you do submit in, that you're being heard, right? And so I'll check in on that, frankly, with the team. But the applications come in, there's just a huge high volume, right? And so as mentors apply in, as mentees apply in, we have to prioritize and then choose which ones to interview and what time, right? And particularly in the last 4 or 5 months, it's been a bit crazy given everything going on. And so definitely follow up. You can send myself an email or send me a tweet on Twitter, and I'll connect with you there, and we can definitely unpack that if there's anybody else who's applied in and hasn't heard back from us. So getting back to the talk, right, in terms of the objectives, right, so after you have those OKRs set with the mentee, right, these are OKRs that the mentee owns, you really want to have them that schedule, right, because the OKRs actually play into the schedule. Now, whether that schedule is the in-person meetings or connecting by email as well, those are really important things to go into, right? And so the cadence that you're going to go after in part reflect on the OKR. So there may be work tied to the key results that it's going to take 3 weeks for the mentee to be able to do pieces of that work. Well, that doesn't mean that in the in-between, you don't have other problems and other topics that you go after, right? PMs have many things going on in their day. It's not just this one OKR they set, right? So as a mentor, another really good thing to do is to layer in career development consistently and throughout every session, right? And so touching on what are the objectives they have as a product manager, where they want to be heading, and recognize that frankly, like every week, like things just move so fast that they gain new insights, they gain new perspective, they gain new questions. So, start every session with, what have you done next time? And definitely try and end each session with, okay, what are the next steps, right? The whole goal is to be moving forward during any working session. And those next steps can involve both, the OKR that you set, but it can also involve the secondary set. So for instance, I've worked with mentees who've had objectives to get a promotion, right? And so then we unpacked, okay, what does it take to get a promotion? What does that potentially look like at your company? Does it involve getting more expertise and demonstrating more knowledge? Does it involve having a larger impact, getting more people to look to you as an expert in these areas? Okay, if so, what are areas that your company may have blind spots where you can go and become an expert where other people aren't yet experts, and now you can help guide and lead, right? So those are the kinds of things that as a mentor, you need to be, like, again, really listening and understanding, and then asking questions. And ultimately, like, if you do it best, if you really do it successfully, the mentee is framing the answers, and the mentee is actually guiding and leading, and your questions aren't taking them down a path, but they're giving a world of context into which your mentee then chooses which path they want to take, which questions they want to take, which topics they want to be discussing with you. And so, like, I've been doing this now for 3 years. The few times I've been lucky enough to be in the same coast, or if I happen to fly in New York, I get to meet with the mentees in person. But as we scale the program, as you may get out there, and if you're engaging, and I'll touch on this later, as far as like where you find mentees and also where you find mentors, if you connect with people that aren't in the city you're in, you're going to be doing things via video. And definitely now, today, right, we're doing everything by video. So it's really good, and there's ways to build rapport there. I'm not going to touch on those in this talk, but there's some resources online if you guys want to send me questions by email. I'm certainly happy to share additional resources as far as how to build rapport effectively when your first meeting is via video versus an in-person session. Just because reading body language ends up being different. Distractions can be key, right? I'm going to touch on that in this next slide of what it's like to be doing connecting via video, right? Things like that. So as I mentioned, like, listening deeply is really key. And like, right now I'm sitting here with 2-3 monitors in front of me, right? I have 2 mobile phones as well. But even with all of that distraction or potential for distraction, there are things you can do to minimize that, right? And so, like, the image on the left, that's definitely a do. Like, if the only thing you're seeing is yourself and them on the other end, then it's really good. You're very deeply focused in that conversation. You may want to have notes at that point. You could split part of your screen to be notes, or you could just be taking handwritten notes depending on how fast the conversation is going and your particular method of taking notes and logging things. You definitely don't want to, though, be using one of those tools that pops the video out and you have tons of things going on in the background and you're checking your email and you're reading up on Wikipedia and stuff. Now, there may be certain topics, or if you're going to be sharing an article, where you will want to do that. And actually, this is the great part about doing mentoring via video calls, that you can share your screen, you can pull up articles, right? So like, I have a library of hundreds of articles that I found useful. And when certain topics come up, I'm actually able to pull that up and share that with my mentees and help kind of guide the conversation by giving it a piece of pause, letting them read that, hearing what they think about it, and kind of having that discussion, right? Very much like if you've ever been in certain reading groups and things like that, it's read this, discuss it, and then figure out how does it apply to your job, to your work, right? And so again, like, it's objective, work backwards, ask those clarifying questions, discover what's going on, right? And if you're having issues, or like, rather, if the mentee isn't necessarily hitting onto the issue, like, it's okay to share perhaps, like, what have you yourself had as challenges in the past? What have other mentees you've had worked with, what challenges might they have had, to kind of help frame, like, what are the common challenges, right? And that's why that list in the beginning is actually really key as well, is that if you think about that, okay, these are the things that most product managers at some point in their career are dealing with. And so depending on where your mentee is, right, you can use that to help guide them to pick the one thing that maybe is most important to them in their current stage of their career, or where they think they're going to be during the engagement period that you're operating in. And so that's the point about the questions and the guiding, right? And so these are some of the some of the things that I recommend doing, right? Like, so definitely don't tell the mentee, right? Like there could be instances where they say, hey, I have a meeting with my CEO coming up and it's gonna be about this. What do you think I should say? Like, that's a landmine. You could run right into that and you could say, hey, awesome, here's what I would do. And you should totally say boom, boom, boom. But when you do that, you take away the ownership that the mentee has over that question and over the answer. And you really don't want to do that. Like, your job as a mentor is to give all that autonomy, all that ownership to the mentee, and in many ways be more of a mirror, more of a reflection to help them understand if what they're proposing, like, does it really play out, right? And then to be that sounding board. So you could actually say, okay, cool, let me pretend to be your CEO, let you come in and you say what you're planning to say, and let's, like, just devil's advocate, right? Let's take it 1, 2, 3 ways, see how you respond to those different situations, right? And I've done that a bunch as a mentor, right? Whether it's on the career development path where I'm helping them understand how might you communicate to a manager that you are, warrant a raise, warrant a promotion, warrant more projects being thrown your way, or if it's a problem space of, like, how do you communicate with your engineers, right? Pretend to be that engineer, pretend to, like, be in that space asking those questions, right? And so that's another thing that really mentors bring value as, is that you're not just guiding, but you're really being that partner, right? Like treating it like a play to actually practice. Right, so the same way that if I was doing soccer or doing baseball, there's only so much I can get by being on my own. But there's a whole other level I get to as soon as you put another person in play that you're passing the ball back and forth with, or you're kicking it back and forth with, right? The same thing goes here with product management, product mentorship. And so you always want to be getting specific, right? And I'm going to be touching on that a bit more as well, but like asking these types of questions, right? So like, why might that be the case? How might you solve that? What would your first step be, right? And so that's key. And instead of getting into the yeses and the nos, instead of getting into whys that may blame people, right? In particular, the whys, well, very useful historically, you want to be careful of those in this type of context. And instead of saying why, it's often better to focus on how, because how at times helps remove the people from the problem, look at what that problem is, and then how you go about solving it. And the great thing about that is that once you have options or thoughts for how you go about solving it, then you can actually unpack that into what the next steps are. And this is great for the mentor-mentee schedule, in that you can then say, okay, great. So what are the next steps? Like, let's say it's a really big, hairy thing, right? Like, I need to set a vision. That is a huge, hairy problem that many PMs deal with. And many PMs aren't necessarily sure how to take that big thing and unpack it, right? And so working with your mentee to set, okay, like, what are the next 2 steps that you think you can take between this week and next week, really helps them take that really large, ambiguous problem and bring it down to size, right? Make it more bite size. It's kind of that whole, like, how you eat the elephant, bite by bite, right? You can't just go and eat it all in one go. And so before I move on, right, there's another question I'm going to go ahead and pull up. So Trisna is wondering, if I'm a new mentor, still progressing on my product management skills, and I don't yet have the answer for my mentee's specific question, how should I go about providing appropriate guidance? And this is a tricky question, right? Or a tricky situation, rather. And there's a couple of different methods that I've used before when encountering this. First, just being transparent and helping the mentee understand that I don't have the perfect answer here, the perfect expertise, right? So, there was a point in my career where I hadn't been doing air gap enterprise solutions. So had I encountered a problem dealing with that, I wouldn't have the answer. And so by owning that you don't have the answer, then you can flip to the next thing, right? Which is going to be potentially 2 options. Although there are others that you could consider, but the 2 that I tend to go to are, 1, hey, let's learn about this together. Let's dive deeper into it. Potentially, let's even pull up, if there's books, if there's articles. This gets back to, like, why I built up a library of other knowledge outside myself that I can tap into. Let's go there and let's figure out if there's an answer that we can unpack and pull from that together, right? So you make it a paired learning exercise. The other is that as a product manager, right, as you go through your career, you're going to be building up relationships with other people. You're going to be building up a very large network potentially, right? So, I've managed across 5 companies at this point. I have a large network of people, experts in industrial design, experts in web design, mobile design, engineering, API design, stream engineering, et cetera. So if there are topics that come up that full well are not your expertise, but may be aligned with people within your network, then it's really a question of, can you tap into them? And I've done this a few times, right, where a question has come from a mentee. And I've owned that I may not have the answer, but I reckon I can say that there's another person that I've worked with, maybe even mentored, that I think might be worth talking with, right? And so I say, hey, would you like me to see if they're willing to have an intro, to have a conversation, right? And then I'll reach out, right, to that other person. I'll say, hey, I'm working with a mentee around this problem. We've hit this topic that I'm not, quite confident, I'm not quite an expert in, but I think your expertise could really come to bear here. Would you be willing to, do a call or to do a session with them, right? And usually that ends up working to help answer or work through that type of a problem, right? And if neither of those really work, right, then you can also unpack things about, like, are there people within that person's company, for instance, right, that have other expertise and other things to play, right? And if so, and this is kind of that third option I was talking about, then the question is how to help the mentee build up that confidence to go and ask those people within their own company to have that conversation, whether it's over a coffee, over a tea, over a bagel, right? And definitely now, when we're all on video, it can be a little bit tricky, right? How do you kind of approach that person, right? Sometimes it's easier to do that in person, but there are ways to do that now as well through video calls, and being really clear on, like, why you're asking for that question, why you're helping, why you're asking for their expertise, right? At the end of the day, like, frankly, there are answers out there, right? It's just a question about finding the person who's willing to help you go after that. So, once you've the questions, right? This gets into that next step piece, and this is that accountability and accessibility, right? And so the accessible piece is actually really important. As a product mentor, you need to make yourself accessible, and that really actually requires that you do other work up front, and that you need to communicate with your family, communicate with your colleagues that you are actually mentoring other people, that you have this additional thing that you're doing, right? And help them understand why you're doing it, what the value is to you personally in your career, but also, to you as a person, right? And when you do that, it helps carve out that space that, if your mentee happens to only be available for this one time, that you can maybe adjust some scheduling at work or at home so that you can take that call, that you can help that mentee through, right? By that same token, right, the mentee needs to also be a little bit accountable, accessible, right? And that they need to be accountable for the work, the next step, stepping up and doing it, holding themselves accountable. But there's this question of flexibility that also comes into play, right? So, like, I went on honeymoon for 2 weeks during this session, right? So, like, I had a mentee that for 2 weeks, I was like, well, I'm probably not going to be online. I really and frankly, the mentee was kind of like, dude, check out, go do your honeymoon. I'll work through it. We'll have topics when we come back, right? And so what we agreed on was that the time that wasn't being covered then, we would make it up, right? And so we started doing double sessions and flexibility, right? And then, COVID hit and all the rest of it, but we still worked through it. And we made ourselves accessible. We even ended up doing a shared Google document at some point so that questions could be listed out in front. I could weigh in on these things asynchronously, and that could actually guide what goes into the next session, right? And so that way, to what degree we can, we're aligned in between. So it's not just, step and then you spend the first 20 minutes like realigning and understanding context, right? But you can really get in there and go deep so that every hour is as high impact and as high value as possible for your mentee, right? And then similarly, like I said prior in this question with Trisna, right, of like, if you open the door for other people, like, that is a promise, right? So if you promise to do that, do everything in your power to make that a reality. If you mention an article, right, track it down. Share it. If there's a book that you mention, make sure that you share that with them so that they get access to it. And then also follow up. Find out if they did get access to it, if they were able to get the lessons, right? We did that this last session. I shared some books, some articles with a mentee, and then we got to actually discuss them, the merits of those and their downside as well, right? So, like, that part's really key, right? Is that if you say you're going to do something, you really do need to do it. And if you say you're going to be available, you need to make yourself available. So, we've kind of covered the whole how to be as effective as a product mentor, right? And so if you feel, right, that you're now willing or want to go after this challenge of being a product mentor, right, there's a few places that I personally have found people that I've mentored. And there are, frankly, there's probably tons of other options, right? But I'm going to just walk through a few of them. That way you guys are aware or have that aspect that I have as well, right? So, overall, there's basically two buckets I think about, and it's inside my company and it's outside my company, right? And so like I mentioned, even when I was a 4-person company that grew to 40 people, there was a lot of demand for mentorship in that company. And so I found that within the company. As I scaled to a 1,000-person company, we actually had formal programs put in place. And so I wound up mentoring people that were in design and product, but I also then ended up doing formal mentoring with people who were just early in their career, right? And they wanted to understand how to go about getting from this point to this point in the career. And in this case, some of them were in customer success or in sales, right? And that's not my perfect field of expertise, right? But I still had lessons and frameworks to help apply to them and share with them. But frankly, the key thing being how to mentor, right? That's the framework being applied. And when you do that, you're able to guide somebody, even if, to Trista's point, I don't have the expertise, I can still help guide them through and give them the questions and give them access to the information and kind of lay out a path that helps them focus, right? Because half the time, the challenge for the mentee is actually just there's so much going on. How do you pick from all of these things the one thing to go after? And when you do go after that one thing, how do you know that you're moving towards it in a good progress, right? So the outside of the company, right, one of them is the product mentor, right? Which, thankfully Jeremy Horn and folks set up, years ago as an extension of the product group. But as, time has gone on, right, since 2015 even on, there's been a huge just of product management content going on and product management communities going on, right? And now there's many different niches, and I'll touch on those a little bit later, but Slack communities are pretty good. You can probably just pull up Google and punch in a thing saying product manager communities, product manager Slack, and you'll find some of them, right? But I'm also going to list a few of the ones here that I think I've found to be quite productive and that there's really a higher volume of people in them and high quality conversations, and also people really looking to mentor and to mentee, to have menteeship in that. The other thing that I found somewhat useful is the whole career advice feature from LinkedIn, which I'll touch on as well. But the product mentor group, right, we have this whole product mentor, and you can go in and apply, right? And you can choose to apply to be a mentor, to be a mentee. As I mentioned earlier, right, there's just a massive volume of people, so we do what we can to navigate through it and to answer them all and interview them all as we can. But again, right, there's only so many of us and so many of you. So again, if you have suggestions for how we can scale, certainly share them with me, and I'll make sure that Jeremy and the rest of the team hears them, and we think about how to best address that, right? But as I mentioned, there's this LinkedIn aspect, right? And so the cool thing about this is that people end up asking questions, and depending on your settings that you put in place, right, they can be within your network, and they'll end up coming to you. And there's been some really interesting ones that I've seen, and then we've used those as a trigger for a conversation, and it's not as intensive of a mentorship as I've done through the product mentor, but it's still, sometimes 4 or 5 calls to talk through these questions, for instance, right? And so a common one that I've seen is engineering managers or engineering individual contributors who want to know, should they get into product management? Should they get into product operations? What does that even entail, right? And how can they go about doing that if they don't feel confident bringing that up inside of their company because they're worried it may put them at risk of being seen as like not loyal to the company, not loyal to their role, right? And so there's a lot of questions that can come in there, right? Or even, most recently a PM from PayPal asking like, how can I advance my career? That's a really broad, open question, right? But that's also a great one to unpack with them to figure out, okay, how are you thinking about your career as a product manager? How are you thinking about it in the context of your current company, in the context of where you've been before, right? And so that's a pretty useful thing that it's a little bit lower bandwidth requirement to actually plug into it. But again, the quality of the questions at times is not as good. People aren't as invested. So you have to kind of balance that and have methods of checking and saying, like, is this person really committed, right? Which goes back to that accountability piece. The other ones that I've really enjoyed and found some mentees in as well, and also mentors for myself, beyond the product group, which is where one of the ones that I actually started in early, was in Mind the Product. And then I'm not in this other one, but I've definitely been guiding some of the women PMs that I work with to head in there because there's some really unique perspectives happening in the women in product group based on what I've heard from colleagues of mine that are actually participating in that community and mentoring product managers and product analysts and designers in that community. So if I had to say like 3 to go and like just check out, these would be the 3. And the good news is like, they're relatively open mind, the product's open, the product group is open. Women in product, you have to do an application, but it's, what I understand, it's relatively open, right? So those would be other communities, other areas I would go to. And like, end of the day though, and all of these things, like if you take one thing away from all of this, and there's a lot to take away, but like if you are looking to mentor, then you really need to remember it's not the coaching. It's not about your ego. It's not about telling other people what to do, right? It's absolutely about the mentee. The mentee comes first, and the mentee's problems come first, and you are simply helping them go through those and work through those, right? It's not about you. So, try not to steer and own all the conversations. There may be times where certain questions, trigger a mini soliloquy, and that can be okay, right? Like it's okay. But on the whole, the balance should be the product mentee rather, being able to share and to talk through and to reason through the issues that they're bringing up, right? And so very similar to like if you're going to be interviewing somebody, you don't want to be sitting there and talking and talking and talking. You want to give room for the person being interviewed, to actually work through the problems that you're posing to them, right? And give their answers and learn in that case. And so that's just a really key thing to remember, right? Is that, and it's important because a lot of product managers, we tend to have pretty strong egos. But in this context, right, like check your ego and recognize that this is you giving back to the product community. This is you seeking to help others become better product managers so they actually end up building better products, right? Products maybe you aren't working on, you're not able to touch. And so, in summary, right, the reason that I'm positioning that mentoring others actually helps you level up as a PM is basically these 4 key things, right? You end up learning to listen. And that's a really important skill to have as you become a more senior product manager, dealing with harder problems, with harder customers, with stakeholders that maybe are a bit more contentious at times. But it's also important as you become more of a manager, right? Because you have to learn to listen to your employees and those that you're working with, right? You can't just sit there and tell them. You can't sit there and be on your phone clicking through things and asking them questions and forcing them to only give you answers to what's on the top of your mind, right? You need to understand what's going on within their headspace, within their part of the company as well. And the key there is that by listening, you then understand what's going on. You can choose, or you can weigh in on where to guide them, right? You can help guide them into areas that they may not have even been thinking were that important or critical to go after. And that ability to guide really is one that is expected of product managers as we level up, right? Because we're measured by our impact. And as we level up, our impact is far greater than anything we can do ourselves, right? It's laying things out, communicating the vision, communicating the story, breaking down the pieces of the work and helping other people have full autonomy and ownership over those, and then become fully effective and deliver as well, right? Like that's how you eventually and ultimately scale up as a product manager, becoming a director, becoming a VP, right? And so the piece here is that both of you, actually, the mentee and the mentor, have this safe space basically when you're meeting to practice through these different things, to figure out what's working, what's not, what maybe works for your particular style, right? So like there may be things that I would do that my mentees wouldn't do, right? So then figuring out what works for them. And conversely, learning from what has worked from them and building it back and maybe trying some of it yourself to see if it does work for you, right? So there's this really cool thing where the feedback loop goes both ways, and you as a mentor can actually learn a lot from your mentees. And so like, end of the day, right, you're helping and learning, right? Like learning is the goal. Learning is the ultimate reason to be going and being a mentor, being a mentee. So thank you. This is a link that you can use to sign up to be a mentor in the Product Mentor group. Again, I'll work through how we go through these. There's a lot of demand, but I can tell you, like, we definitely do need more product mentors to be participating, and folks that can really commit the time that it takes to be a mentor, commit the expertise, and be willing to share it, right? And I've also pulled together just a really short thing that I'll continue to evolve out, but it has some tips for people who do want to mentor, right? Where to find them, what are the key checklists, et cetera, right? And so please, if you want to, use those links. So just check, make sure there's no other questions. And so it looks like there are no other questions, but just in case, I'll give you guys like 30 seconds. If there's any other questions you have, go ahead and plug them in. And then I'm going to begin closing out the session. Cool. So it looks like there's not too many other questions coming in. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us today for our discussion of how to become a better product manager by mentoring other product managers. And as always, the presentation will be posted on our SlideShare channel, and this video will be posted up to the Product Way. So don't forget, like I mentioned, you can become a product mentor, just like me, to product people of all sorts all around the world. Just visit theproductmentor.com. Go ahead and submit your application there. You can also follow us on Instagram at Product People. There's some really cool videos up there, insights being shared by other product managers, lessons as well. So even if you don't have access to a product mentor, this channel provides a lot of information and accessibility to you. And definitely, if you do have questions on any of that, like I mentioned, reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn, on Twitter as well. And if you're looking to fill a new product job, we also do have a site that's free to post where people. I've used this in the past actually when hiring, where you can post up the jobs you're looking to fill and make it available to others to find it, right? And so that's going to be over at theproductjobs.com. Quite useful as well. There's a lot of good jobs out there. They started off being really based a lot in New York and other areas, but it's really scaled at this point in time. So definitely go check that out. I know it's maybe not the best time to be looking for a new job, but in case you are, it might be something that's worth check out. So finally, don't forget to please like this video. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye. Oh, sorry. I guess maybe Jeremy can cut this back in later. So there was one other question. How many mentees is it recommended for a mentor to have at one time? And so I think it depends on the depth of the relationship that you're going to be going into. So at any one time, typically I'd say 3 is the most that I've done and been able to effectively juggle while still taking on everything that comes in life with family, with work. But to start, I would say start with 1. And if you can, start with like a shorter kind of session, so say a 2 or 3 month window, right? Sorry, that was a question that came up from Nargis. So how many mentees at a time should we have? So again, start from 1, and then as you figure out what you can juggle and handle, build out from there. Each of the mentees that I've worked with in the past, I end up actually doing monthlies or quarterly calls with them as well. So sometimes the period can just change, right? There's an intense period where you really want to go after an issue. But once you've built that rapport and built that understanding, then you can go after larger career development type problems over a bigger period of time. So these days I have about 8 mentees that I talk with on any given week. So thank you, everybody. And again, remember to like and subscribe.